Hi, here's Mark Galeotti with another short thought on Russian politics, which in this case has actually been stimulated by the downfall, the long-awaited and much to be appreciated downfall of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe at the hands of a military coup. Now, it's worth mentioning, I don't think there's going to be any kind of a military coup against Putin. One thing he does understand is power, and there is a whole interlocked series of control mechanisms in place to ensure that the military, the Secret Service, and so the Kremlin Guard and so forth, none of them could actually carry out such an operation without there being basically a consensus within the whole security elite. We're not there. But nonetheless, what the Zimbabwean, let's call it a coup, for such it was, case demonstrates is that one of the crucial elements was to not drive Mugabe, and by extension those closest to him, right up against the wall. To give them the choice, the option, the hope that they would be allowed to enjoy their ill-gotten gains and live out the rest of their lives, if not in power, at least in security. And this is something we've also very much seen with the rise of Mugabe's former number two, who may well offer some kind of reform. We'll see how real it actually is, but nonetheless does offer that kind of a prospect, a slightly more technocratic modernisation. But meanwhile, no reprisals against Mugabe and even his much despised wife. And so this is one of the lessons that I bring from that to Russia. What do we do with kleptocrats? Now, on one level, obviously from the point of view of the outside world, it provides a point of some degree of traction in policy. Actually sanctioning the kleptocrats specifically is a much more effective tool, in my opinion, than broad economic sanctions that essentially end up A, hitting ordinary Russians, and B, take years or even decades to truly have an impact. We really need to be looking at the people who matter, the people who make decisions, and the people who are their friends, classmates, drinking buddies, sauna mates, and such like. But at the same time, there is a question of, okay, how do you deal with when the situation when it's not just one person, but a whole collection of people who have accumulated considerable power and who therefore have considerable interest in maintaining that? In the interest of natural justice, I would like to feel that someday Putin and those around him will actually get their comeuppance, that there will be trials, that there will be inquiries, that whether it's their role in unexplained murders, both in Russia and without, whether it's their role in looting the Russian treasury. We shouldn't forget, after all, that whatever the Russians have done to others, whether it's Ukrainians and Georgians or people out further afield, actually they have reserved the Kremlin has reserved the greatest amount of punishment for its own people, both Chechens and ordinary Russians. They are the real victims of Putin and Putinism. So on one level, yes, I want to see them brought to justice. But at the same time, if the prospect is purely of trials, war crimes tribunals, lustration committees, probing questions from the tax authorities, etc., it gives the current deeply pragmatic elite absolutely no reason to be willing to hand over power. Quite the opposite, it actually forces them into a position in which they have really no alternative but to hang on to it, even if it means Tiananmen Square scenarios or whatever, someday in the future. Again, we're nowhere near that now. Therefore, and this is the unpalatable question to which I have no particularly good answer, is it actually better, in due course, when we come to that situation, or rather when the Russians come to that situation, is to actually offer them a deal? Whether it's a year zero solution, where basically we say, well, don't do anything wrong from now on, but we won't ask what happened before. Is it some kind of process of national reconciliation that carries with it certain promises of immunity? Is it at least even just simply to say, well, you can keep $1 billion, we'll let you have that. Something like that. The Russians will have to make that decision, how important it is to try and find a peaceful settlement of their own. But of course, the outside world will also play a role in how it responds to that. Do we actually say, this is wrong, and we will push against it? Or do we accept it, if that is the case? Ultimately, obviously, it has to be for the Russians to decide. we cannot probably help. But on the other hand, there is a certain Hippocratic oath sort of at work. We can at least seek to do no harm. And when it comes down to it, if we actually have the prospect of genuine and meaningful change someday in the future, and keep needing to stress that, we're not talking about in the 2018 elections or anything like that, but some kind of meaningful change in the future, if so, and if the Russians seem willing to accept the sad moral compromises that involves, then the outside world should not stand in their way. Conversely, if the Russians do decide that actually they're going to do it the hard way, they are going to do it the way that maybe they should have done after 1991, which is precisely put justice above political pragmatism. Likewise, even though that will mean a much more problematic transition, we likewise should be supporting them. So I think in some ways, although Zimbabwe and Russia are very, very different countries in so many different ways, and certainly Putin, for all his flaws, is no Comrade Bob, but nonetheless, I think what happened in Zimbabwe offers some interesting questions, even though we do not yet have any good answers to them. Thanks very much indeed.